Welcome to the first class of our 5-part online course, an advanced look at go-to records. My name is Ginevra Morse, Director of Education and Online Programs here at American Ancestors New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'll be with you over the next 5 weeks as your moderator and organizer for the course. As genealogists, we have certain sets of records that we turn to time and again: vital and church records, state and federal censuses, probate, land, and town records. Of course, none of these resources were created with family historians in mind. So in this course, experts from our research services team will give you the tools and context that you need to dissect, question, and analyze these go-to records. By understanding why, how, and by whom certain records were created, you will become a better researcher, be able to verify connections, and ultimately take your family tree to new heights. Our instructor for our first class is James Heffernan, a senior researcher here at NEHGS. James earned his BA in history at Boston College. Before joining the NEHGS team, he worked in the conservation department of the John J. Burns Library at Boston College and the research library at Plymouth Plantation. Propelled by his interests in genealogy and history, James spent a semester abroad at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. In addition to Slavic history, he is interested in the history of colonial America and 19th century Massachusetts. So in this first class, James will provide you with some basic best practices when analyzing records of any kind. We'll then apply those practices to analyzing and using vital records and church records. Throughout the session, James will also provide a number of case studies and examples on how to use these records in your research and how they can inform new avenues of research going forward. You'll find a PDF of today's slides at the online course page, as well as a handout. And starting tomorrow, you'll also be able to watch a recording of today's presentation on that course page. Again, please make sure that you remain muted throughout the presentation. You will be able to ask questions by typing them into the chat panel, and James will answer as many as he can during 3 designated Q&A sessions. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to James.
Thanks, Ginevra. I'm excited to be speaking to all of you today about the ins and outs of vital records and church records. These records form the gold standard for genealogical research, but can often reveal much more than just what we plug into our family tree. I chose the picture you see here because it's from a marriage, my great-grandparents' 1931 marriage, and marriage records are common to vital and church records, where the 2 record sets overlap. So we're going to start this evening by getting analytical. How do we get the most out of any record we find? That's going to be a major question for us here. How do we pull apart a record for every useful piece of information? I think it's easy sometimes to take a record at face value, grab whatever information we need, and move on. Or worse, only assess the evidence that's convenient for the conclusion we're hoping for instead of taking the time to thoroughly investigate. As we go through some of these analytical tools, I want you to keep a few things in mind. Every record you look at is probably going to have some issues associated with it. Red flags are totally fine. The big picture emerges when you compare records, not just church and vital records, but everything you find about your ancestor. In the end, the more information you get out of each record, the more points you'll have to compare with. We want to reach a point where the records are speaking to each other. The harmonies and similarities will give you certainty about facts from the person's life, and the discord and differences will raise questions for your future research to try to resolve. So I want you to always be questioning the substance and the reliability of a record. Okay, what am I talking about here? The substance is the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of each record. The names, dates, places, and relationships. They're the facts that will eventually land on your family tree. The birthplace that opens up a new location for additional research, or maybe the father's name that finally busts through that long-standing brick wall. On the other hand, reliability is the way that we synthesize the substance. What value do we place on the information we pulled from the record? It can be pretty tricky and somewhat nuanced. You should be asking, what is the record telling us behind all the names, dates, and places? Can we trust it to link with other records? And understand, too, that at the end of deep diving into a record, you might find that the answer isn't so clear-cut. Like I said, comparing the reliability of all the records we find about an ancestor will give us the clearest sense of the facts from their lives. Let's take some time to explore what makes a source or record reliable, and we'll start with a couple of helpful definitions. We use these terms, source and record, all the time in genealogy, sometimes interchangeably, which we should try to avoid. It's important to understand the difference. In its most general sense, a record is a portion of a source related to a single event. A source is a collection of records from a single creator. If we hone in on just a record and ignore the source, then we might unfairly trust the substance over the reliability of a record. We need the larger context. For example, my baptism, with all the fun stuff attached to it, like my parents' names, my godparents' names, the date when it happened, that's a record. The facts of that day, related to me specifically, constitute a record. The source of my baptismal record is the priest who recorded it, the church where it happened, and the 30 or so other records created on that day. The source of the baptism gives the event context. How do we judge whether a record or source can be considered reliable? Here are a few questions you should be asking yourself as you examine any record. Doesn't matter what it is. Newspaper, census record, church record, you name it. And it's by no means exhaustive. As you examine a record, question it, interrogate it, ask it for its lunch money, and draw as many conclusions as you can. We'll take a look at each of these in turn. First, is it the original or a copy? Like a game of telephone, the earliest version of a record is usually the most reliable. When the records are transcribed or copied, there's always a risk for error, that some of the record information will be lost, recorded incorrectly, or intentionally left out. With the added layer of interpretation that comes with indexing record collections to be searchable online, you may end up several versions away from the original content of the record. Whenever possible, go find the original. Most major genealogical websites will include source information at the bottom of an indexed record. Ancestry does a pretty good job of that. I also really like the way that Family Search prepares record citations because it's almost always going to include the microfilm number where the record came from. So for example, this record from Family Search's database, Illinois Deaths and Stillbirths from 1916 to 1947, doesn't directly link to the original record. But the citation does include the number of the microfilm where the information was indexed from. It also has a box to the right of the record with indexing notes that includes the certificate number, in this case, number 28140, recorded as the reference ID. By plugging the microfilm number into Family Search's catalog, you'll be brought to the main page of the collection. Locate the correct microfilm number among the entries and start browsing the images. Sometimes these will only be available at a family history center, but I think it's better to check here first before going through all the time and expense of ordering a copy from the original source. Next, we'll look at an example where locating the earliest version of a source helped us to identify possible transcription errors. This record was pulled from the compiled vital records of Yarmouth, Massachusetts that was published in 2 volumes in 1975. We're looking at the family of William and Susanna Brooks. The vital records of their children are presented as a family group, a form that you'll find often repeated in early New England records. The transcription notes that William Brooks, the father, was born in what looks like Asha Philippa Unreadable GCD, Maine, on December 25th, 1771. The transcriber acknowledges that a portion of the record was, quote, illegible. An initial thought might be that we're looking at a reference to a place from the state of Maine. And it wouldn't be a bad guess either. And you might logically spend some time combing a list of place names in Maine that resembled anything close to Asha Philippa. Viewing the original record and comparing it to the transcription, you might draw your own conclusion as to what it says. Back on the Family Search catalog, we found 2 vital record collections credited to the town clerk of Yarmouth, covering the span of the birth records of the William and Susanna Brooks children. And in the first, we found this: William and Susanna Brooks and their children, organized as a family group, but missing some of the information we found in our transcription, including, conspicuously, the mention of William Brooks' birth from 1771. And that wasn't the only difference we found between the published version and the digitized page. The 1975 version also includes additional information, like that son Thomas was born forenoon, or in the morning. John Brooks' date of death in August 1805 is also missing from the handwritten copy. The digitized record also includes the notation dead next to William and Susanna, which does not appear in the 1975 transcribed entry. The inconsistencies between the two pointed to the fact that the 1975 transcription wasn't made using the handwritten vital records we'd located. So we checked the title page of the source. If you have any questions about where a record is from or when it was created, checking the title page should be able to resolve it and answer some of the who, what, where, when, and why questions surrounding it. From its title page, located about 100 images before the William and Susanna record, we realized we had another transcription on our hands. The handwritten copy was dated from 1819 and was itself a copy of an earlier book of vital records from Yarmouth. So we turned back to the other vital records entry we found in Family Search's catalog. And we finally found the entry that was used in that pesky 1975 compilation. William and Susanna Brooks, their children, and William's funky birthplace. Taking a closer look, we found what was transcribed as Maine was actually just the beginning of the word Manila with a bonus L. And with that, we could piece together the rest of the jarbled entry. William Brooks was probably born in Asia, Philippine, abbreviation for islands, Manila, on December 25th, 1771. We learned not only the meaning of the record, but also a bit about its creator and the creative spellings they used. And that should get you thinking, how reliable is the source? Who created the source? For our purposes, the creators we will be looking at are most often going to be government or church officials, clerks and clerics, whose responsibility it was to report the vital events of a secular or religious community. Every creator will have their own motivations for creating the source or record. The answer is often in the context, something like a government mandate, or as a means to account for the size of a population or congregation, or maybe to track property rights. As you examine the record and the ones around it, do you notice that the source creator has a style that they followed in preparing the record collection? Is the record keeping sporadic? Turning back to our example from Yarmouth, what do we know about the creator of the William Brooks record? Again, this comes mostly from our title page. Other records may have the creator's name attached directly to it. The William Brooks family grouping was created by John Thacker, town clerk, in 1795, and continued by his successors. That's interesting. It implies that each record could be the result of multiple authors. As town clerk, Thacker was likely tasked with a wide range of record keeping, like maintaining notes from town meetings, registering cattle marks, and in this case, registering vital events. Another important consideration toward the reliability of a record is the date of its creation. Ask yourself, how close is the date of the record to the event that the record describes? A vital or church record may be created for an event that occurred any amount of time earlier. The larger the time gap, the more skeptical you should be of the information. Memory blurs with time, and cultural attitudes towards time change as well. The fanfare that surrounds the celebration of birthdays in the United States is a relatively recent development, only stretching back to the 19th century. Before that, it was the year of one's birth, their age, that was more consequential than the exact date. You've no doubt seen in your own research examples where someone's gravestone or death record says they were born on one day, but their actual birth record tells a totally different story. Returning again to our favorite couple, William and Susanna Brooks, remember that the title page tells us that the volume was started in 1795, but updated by successive town clerks. The evidence of all those successive town clerks can be seen all over our record. We identified what looks like 3 separate hands, but you could argue that there are more or less. We have the heading for the group and the first child, Thomas, which we can roughly date to his birth in 1796. We labeled that grouping number 1 in the top left corner. A second clerk is likely responsible for the births of the next 3 children, Jenny, Susanna, and William, from 1798 to 1802, and maybe that little note forenoon, and below that dead, beside the entry for Thomas Brooks. I also think that these entries were made at once, probably shortly after the birth of William Brooks in 1802. The ink is consistent between the 3. Of the 3 records, William's birth record is the only one that offers an exact birth date, October 27, 1802. Jenny and Susanna just have the month and year. That makes me think that the record was updated after William's 1802 birth, and that the informant couldn't remember the exact birth dates for Jenny and Susanna. The third clerk, labeled in the image with an orange 3, returned to record the births and death of the 2 John Brooks. Comparing the handwriting, we assigned William Brooks' 1771 birth record at the bottom of the grouping to the first town clerk. The B's used in the last name Brooks are not exact matches, but the swish of the W in William makes me think it's the same hand. With that in mind, it too probably dates to 1796. But how much can we trust a birth record recounted 25 years later when the birth itself happened in the Philippines? Just a hunch, but the fact that the date is reported as December 25th, Christmas, also makes me question whether it's genuine or not. Most vital and church records follow a familiar structure. By the end of the 19th century, most were being maintained in registers or recorded into designated forms. Earlier records, like the one we've been examining, are recorded in freehand and may be found in town, county, or court records. Without a register or a template to follow, each clerk had a bit more leeway in the detail of the records. I've seen some records that name when a child was born without naming the parents, while others will include information about the time of day when the birth happened, the grandparents' names, and where each of the parents were from. Become familiar with the source. That includes looking at the title page, but also the records surrounding your record of interest. Are there any major differences in the way that they were prepared compared to your record of interest? Is there anything missing? Looking at the other records near the William Brooks family group, which is at the top of the page there, we see the pattern repeated. A heading with the name of the parents, entries for each child in chronological order, and the appearance of multiple hands. The pages before and after also include 3 families per page. The William Brooks family stands out from the records around them because of the inclusion of that William Brooks 1771 birth outside of Yarmouth. It was the difference that probably led the later town clerk from 1819 to leave it out of his copy of the Yarmouth Vital Records. It broke the formula, so he chose to ignore it. Finally, in determining the reliability of a record, we have to consider who provided the information. This isn't always obvious. Earlier records, especially, tend not to have a designated area for an informant. In the case of the William Brooks grouping, the information likely came from Brooks himself. Who else would know the particulars of his birth in Manila in 1771? So we return to the original question. Is this record reliable? I have a lot of reservations about it. The William Brooks birth breaks the formula, providing specific information for a birth that occurred at least 20 years prior. Would I be surprised to find another record claiming a different date of birth for him? Nope. Would I be surprised to find evidence that he wasn't born in Manila, but somewhere else outside North America? I wouldn't be surprised at all. Would I include the birthplace and date into my family tree? Yeah. In spite of my reservations, it may be the only evidence we ever locate for his birth. So let's say that you do assign that birth date and place to William Brooks in your family tree. Make sure to also make a note about all those questions you raised about its reliability. A worksheet like this one can be helpful in organizing your thoughts about a record you just picked apart. Comparing the reliability of two records may lead you to choosing one over another, and it's much easier to compare when you have all your impressions organized in front of you. Customize your record analysis notes with the questions that are most important to you when determining the reliability of a record. Your worksheet will help with genealogical linking. After we've determined that a record is reliable enough to use as evidence, how do we relate it to the other records we found for an ancestor? This is done by determining the qualities of the record that are specific to the individual and noting discrepancies when the two records are compared. In other words, we're talking about comparing the substance of two records. The intersection of the substance of two records will inform whether you accept both records as being from the same individual or not. Differences might exist, so look instead at the preponderance of evidence. Look at it on the whole, and only be satisfied when you've determined that you have a sound, explicit reason for saying that any two records refer to the same person. Here's an example of two records that we're hoping to link together. On the left is a record of the December 25, 1859 marriage of Alonzo P. Rowland and Mary at Loss in Tuscola County, Michigan. What kind of substance does the record have for Mary at Loss? It says she was about 19 years old at the time of the marriage, placing her birth around 1840. The marriage was performed in the township of Juniata. Her married name became Rowland. On the right, we have the 1900 death record for a Mary at Rowland. What information is corroborated by the death certificate? This Mary at Rowland had the maiden name Loss. Obviously a huge check mark there. The marriage record says that Mariette was about 19 at the time. The death certificate says that she was 18 at the time of her first marriage. Not an exact match, but pretty close. It's not uncommon for a bride's age to be inflated, possibly to bypass age restrictions placed on marriages. The Mary at Loss from the marriage record was born about 1840, while the death certificate gives a birth date of 1843. Finally, the marriage took place in the same location as the death. We either have two Mary at Losses, married to Rowland men, living in the same place, born within 3 years of each other, or these records refer to the same person. Even with our hunch that it's true, we'll need to shore up our argument by looking at other records. So I'd like to stress that you should always remember to be skeptical. Take your time with each record and think about not just what it's saying, but why it's saying it.
All right. Well, thank you, James, for that great overview of how to analyze records and what we should be questioning on kind of a consistent basis. So let's pause here. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat panel, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. I will also mention that the analysis worksheet that James referenced is available as a downloadable PDF on the course webpage. So as you start to analyze records and apply these practices to your own research, that worksheet should become very handy. And I know that we will also be using it for your homework assignment. So again, if you have any questions, go ahead and enter them into the chat panel. Well, it looks like there are no questions because everything was just super clear, and I know that we have a lot to get through with both vital records and church records. So again, keep your questions coming, and we'll get to them in the next 2 Q&A sessions. But for right now, I'm going to turn things back over to James, and we're going to start looking at vital records.
Thanks again. Now, we're going to take a more in-depth look at vital records. It's hard to understate the value of a good vital record, not least because of the specific rich detail it can provide about an ancestor's birth, marriage, or death. In this section, we'll go over the nuts and bolts of vital records, where to find them, and how to get the most out of them. When we talk about vital records anywhere, it's important to understand who or what is responsible for keeping them. In the United States, that authority lies with the individual states. The states then cooperatively report generalized statistics to the federal government. The vital records that we're after as genealogists may have been maintained at the local, county, state, or provincial level. Record-keeping practices can be extremely locality specific, so it pays to do a little research on your area of interest first. You may also find that copies of a record are to be found in multiple places. Many states originate their records in the municipality where the event occurred, with another copy reported to the state. It's a neat way of getting around records that might have been destroyed in one place or the other. Early vital records were maintained primarily as a method of tracking property and inheritance rights. In many places, the right to own property or to vote was determined by a person's age. These records tend to be bare bones, though. Little more than the date of an event and the main subjects. The records recorded, protected, and kept tended to be those that dealt with money. In the 19th century, as urbanization and industrialization kicked into high gear and large waves of European immigrants arrived in the United States, one unfortunate result was the proliferation of infectious disease due to poor sanitation in overcrowded cities. One way that reformers sought to manage sanitation in cities was to monitor population growth and decline, as well as track the frequency of disease. This created a push for the collection of detailed information on each person and explains why statewide record-keeping exploded across the country in the tail end of the 19th century. Cities and towns had to rethink urban planning to respond to growing populations. Where should we put new cemeteries with the old ones filling up so quickly? Or how do we meet the demand for housing? But not everybody caught on to the reforms immediately. Even in places where the laws were on the books requiring the collection of vital records, it might take years for the locality to comply. It's also helpful to know what records have survived and are available to search. In a place where records were destroyed, say in a courthouse fire, you may be able to rely on another copy of the record stored somewhere else. All too frequently, however, the record will have been permanently lost. To find out what records exist for a particular location, consult genealogical handbooks like the Genealogist's Handbook to New England Research or the Red Book, which we've referenced here. Family Search also has helpful wiki articles that outline the dates when major record keeping began. They will also usually contain information related to record loss. There's no sense in looking for a vital record where one was never created. In this example, from Winnebago County, Illinois, we can see that marriage records were maintained by the county starting in 1839, with birth and death records following more than 30 years later. Keeping in mind that record keeping is locality specific, we can note some regional patterns. Many New England towns maintained vital records as far back as the 17th century, with civil registration introduced in the 19th. The earliest records are usually found among town records with little organization. Births can be listed chronologically or in family groups like the one we saw from Yarmouth. Vermont is kind of an interesting example. While they were late to the civil registration party starting only in 1919, they did create a statewide directory from their older vital records. And they tend to look like this record from Barre, Vermont. The substance of this record is that Lyman Bowdwin Currier was born on August 23, 1811, son of Anna and Andrew Currier. The town clerk was W. Ellis. We see that in the bottom right-hand corner. You'll notice that very little information from the form is filled out. It's a mess of hyphens and underscores. It's an indication that the record has been adapted from its original formula. The fonts and typeface look much too modern to be from 1811. So where's the original record? In this case, information about the original source can be found on the reverse. This transcriber was thorough enough to include the reference to the exact volume and page where the record was extracted. In general, I recommend that with any vital or church record you're viewing online, that you should also examine the page before and the page after to make sure that you don't miss any additional information attached to the record. And always look for the original. So here's Lyman's birth record, with additional information that didn't make it to the later extract. When we examine the reliability of this record, we should note that it includes the birth date, 25th of August, 1811, as well as when it was recorded by the town clerk almost 2 years later on March 15th, 1813. How can we be sure that Lyman was actually born in Barre, Vermont, if his birth wasn't recorded until 2 years later? How can we be sure that that birth date is correct? I've been tracking the family of Lyman Baldwin Carrier for a while before I came across this transcribed record for Lyman Bowdwin Courier. While the transcribed record gave me little confidence that I'd found the correct family, the original gave me the sound and explicit evidence I needed. In the mid-Atlantic states, marriage records were often the first to be collected. Marriages were contracts as much as unions with financial implications. Birth and death records tend to begin later in the 19th century, with the exception of some of the larger cities like New York City and Philadelphia. This is an example of an early Philadelphia death record, this time reported not by a clerk, but by a physician. The first substantive bit of information, right there in the first line, is Ezekiel Meredith's cause of death from variola, a form of smallpox. You can extrapolate that how Ezekiel Meredith died was much more important to the city of Philadelphia, and obviously the doctor that reported it, than who he was. The record includes his residence and age, but little else. The notation in the bottom left corner refers to his interment at the Union Burial Ground in Philadelphia in row 1, grave 29. Like the mid-Atlantic states, Southern and Midwestern states placed an emphasis on marriage records as a means of tracking property rights. Your earliest Midwestern vital records will probably be found on the county level, mainly because waves of migration created new settlements throughout the 19th century, and new settlements take time to establish and form laws. It was easier to centralize record keeping regionally than locally. Here's an example of a marriage bond between James Christie and Eliza Herron in Shelby County, Kentucky in 1815. It's important to note that the date of the marriage bond is not the date of the marriage itself. The groom would post the bond at the courthouse. The amount described, in this case 50 pounds, would serve as a penalty if a reason was discovered why the couple should not marry, like if it was discovered that one of the parties was already married. Oops. The marriage usually, but not always, took place several days later. Bond records may also include a note of consent from the bride's father if she was underage. The groom signed as well as a bondsman, usually a male relative of the bride. So we see the groom's signature at the bottom, James Christie, and then the bondsman, Evan Miles. The states in the Great Plains in the West were some of the last to introduce statewide record collection. It makes sense considering they were also some of the last to rise to statehood. Before that, emphasis was placed mainly on county or territorial records. It should be noted too, before we move on, that statewide collection of vital records in Hawaii, which isn't directly covered by this, started as early as 1842 with varying degrees of compliance. With the introduction of social and welfare programs in the 20th century, a greater importance was placed on vital statistics as a method of proving someone's identity. In particular, birth records established citizenship as immigration became more restricted. Most localities established methods of retroactively registering a vital record. The applicant was normally required to produce corroborating evidence to support the details of their marriage or birth. And it wasn't just a United States thing. The province of Nova Scotia began registering births in 1864, but stopped in 1877, and put the practice back in place in 1908. In 1919, the provincial government approved legislation allowing for the delayed registration of birth records. This is an example of a delayed birth registration, dated 1928, applied for on behalf of my great-great-grandmother, Martina Wilson Morrissey, who was supposedly born on September 7, 1883, in Belmont, Colchester County, Nova Scotia. The application, which is dated April 10, 1928, was submitted by Mary Allen of Parsboro, Cumberland County, Nova Scotia, Martina's aunt. The only evidence given to support Martina's parentage and birth date is a testimony from Mary Allen that because she was Martina's aunt, she could, quote, well remember the circumstances at the time of her birth. On its face, there's little to question about the testimony, and I would never intentionally impugn on Aunt Mary Allen's credibility. However, when you do a little research on Mary Allen, as you should any name attached to any record of interest, you find that she was the aunt of Martina's husband, James Morrissey, and that the families were unlikely to have known each other back in 1883. So back to the question of the day, is this record reliable? Probably not. Grammy Tina needed a copy of her birth record in order to apply for an immigration visa to the United States. Those motivations likely caused her to ask her husband's elderly aunt to vouch for her at the record office. So remember to be skeptical. And also remember that the same record may exist in different forms, with different information on each. As ever, we want to locate the earliest copy, which is usually held by the municipality of origin. In cases where you order a record from a town or county clerk or state registrar, always make sure to indicate that you want a full genealogical copy of the record. In an ideal world, you'd always receive a photocopy of the original register. Clerks will often adapt the information into new forms that can be certified for official use, but can omit information from the original record. A short form record will include most of the information from the original, but may leave out detailed information not directly related to the subject. In this example, we have the marriage of William Adams and Elizabeth Snyder from Woonsocket, Rhode Island, but we're missing information related to their parents, which would have been found on the original register. A long form record will typically contain all of the information from the original and can be certified for official use. Long-form records are preferred by lineage societies for proving descent. Here's an example of a long-form marriage certificate. In cases where the same event was recorded at two different levels, try to examine both or all of them and try to collect as many copies as you can. In Massachusetts, records are kept at the town level, and then a copy is transferred to the state. And that's common in a lot of states in the United States. This example is the 1894 state death record of Mary Banahan Cairns of Boston. The record, which holds important information about her residence, cause of death, and parents, is missing a valuable piece of information that you can find on the city copy. So here's the same record, but the copy filed at Boston City Hall, and you can see it takes on a very different structure. The city copy includes information about her place of burial. This is potentially valuable information that we could use to search for burial records, in this case from Mount Calvary Cemetery. After the introduction of statewide reporting of vital statistics, most records took on a familiar template, allowing us to point out some of the key characteristics of each record group. A birth record is designed to communicate that a child was born at a certain time, in a certain place, to certain parents. On occasion, a birth record will also include information about the ages and birthplaces of the parents, as well as the number of children born to the mother. The informant was most often one of the parents, or the information came through an intermediary like a hospital where the birth occurred, the doctor who performed the operation, or midwife. These records tend to be highly reliable when they describe events that have just occurred. Marriage records are designed to communicate the civil union of two people at a certain place at a certain time. Sometimes that's all they'll say. A married B at place on date. Sometimes they'll include additional information for each person, including their age, birthplace, occupation, and the names of their parents. A marriage record will also often name the officiant, which we'll talk more about in the next section. A marriage record may also include a marriage license number, which can be used to find the original application. The marriage license and the marriage record may differ in the questions they ask. On rare occasions, the names of the witnesses are also included. The informants on a marriage record are usually the participants, so we generally rate these records as reliable for information on the subjects. Death records will include information on the accumulated facts of someone's life at the time of their death. The reliability of the record can be questionable depending on who the informant is. Let's take a closer look at a death certificate similar to any that you might find across the country in the early 20th century. and this one was prepared by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It contains 20 sections of information with varying degrees of usefulness to us as genealogists. Section 1 is his place of death in Cornplanter, Pennsylvania. The death place isn't always the same as the place of residence, so be careful with that. If this record was from a larger city, this is where you would find a more specific street address, including the number of the ward. City tax records are normally arranged by wards, so this is potentially useful information. Cornplanter must not be too large for them to leave the address section blank. Section 2 is the name of the deceased. And my sympathies to you if you ever find yourself researching someone with the name John Smith. Sections 3 through 5 cover the personal information, the sex, race, and marital status. Section 6 has the birth date that may or may not be accurate. I always take that section with a grain of salt. I usually assume that the reported birth date is within a few years of the event. Sometimes I find that the birth date is correct, but the year is off. Sometimes all three are. Section 7 reiterates what the birth date told us. It's not uncommon for the age to be given as about something, like about 77. Section 8 is the occupation, which could be very useful for distinguishing between John Smiths on census and directories. Section 9 covers the birthplace. Here's another that I pretty much take with a grain of salt. The informant is basing this information on recollection. Especially in instances where a person moved a lot during their lifetime, the reported birthplace might be anywhere along the way. Sections 10 through 13 cover the deceased parents. And what we see here is pretty common. The father's name is offered up with little else. When spouses act as informants, you can often see the limits of their knowledge when it comes to their in-laws. The deceased child may not be sure where their grandparents were from or what their names were. This section also tends to be a letdown when the deceased dies at an institution or a hospital, and they take on the responsibility of reporting the death. They may not have asked such detailed questions on their intake registers. Section 14 names the informant, in this case Mrs. Barbara Smith of Oil City, Pennsylvania. This is most often a close relative like a spouse, a child, or a parent. Researching the name of the informant could result in a new path for research. When I check census records, Barbara Smith was John Smith's wife. Below that is the name of the local registrar responsible for filing the record. In this case, Nell Fahey also went back through the certificate to fill in any areas left blank. The penciled marks can be seen in the birthplace of John Smith's mother and parts of the medical report. Likely this was just to get the record up to a certain standard before being filed. Scooting back up to the top of the record, we find the date of death, followed by the report of the attending physician. The cause of death may or may not be of interest to you. If the death was an accident or tragedy, it may have caught headlines and you should check newspaper archives. While not very common, it may also lead to a coroner's report. If it was nefarious, maybe there were court actions. That code, 4028, that you see written across this section is probably a clerical code used to report en masse information about what corn planters were dying of in 1920. Section 18, information on the length of a hospital stay or institutionalization, can help us track down hospital and institutional records when and if they still exist. Sections 19 and 20 cover the burial of the body and includes the cemetery, date of burial, and the undertaker's name and address. If you're lucky, this can lead to locating burial records, gravestones, and funeral records. After we've proven that a record is for our ancestor and added that date to our tree, where can the record take us next? Here's a sampling of the diverse record groups that you might find yourself searching in after examining a vital record. In general, it's worthwhile to explore every name and every place used to describe your ancestor's life on a vital record. So we'll look at this example. Captain Charles Stubbs died on March 12, 1864 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. His death certificate includes his age, cause of death, occupation, and birthplace. It also contains his address, which can be used to locate the family in city directories. And here he is in the 1864 Philly City Directory. If there had been more than one Charles Stubbs in the directory, we could use the information from the vital record to determine which he was. You can also cheat your way into a partial census record if you can locate multiple people listed at the same address. So what else is on that death record? We also have the name of the undertaker, D.H. Bowen, of North 15th, South 2nd Street. Again, if you're lucky, you might find funeral records to document an ancestor's burial. This is taken from the daybook of D.H. Bowen Funeral Home in Philadelphia and has interesting information like the number of carriages used in the funeral procession and the dimensions of Captain Stubbs' coffin. Not a tall man, apparently. This death record also notes that Charles Stubbs was buried at Lafayette Cemetery. Do any interment records exist? We located the interment register from Lafayette Cemetery that includes information about the plot where he was buried, noted here as plot WC6 and grave number 3, which allowed us to turn to the plot itself. And there he is, C. Stubbs, under the column for interments in grave number 3. The other graves in a family plot are likely to contain close relatives, opening up additional avenues for further research.
All right, well, thank you again, James. So let's pause here and see if you have any questions. Go ahead and type them into the chat panel on the right of your screen. So in the first section, you emphasize the importance of seeking out original copies or original records. So Grace asks, when looking at records online, would you consider seeing the original image on the screen? So a digitized image of the original. Is that, in your mind, the original, or do you need to seek out an actual physical paper copy of the original? To what length do you need to go?
It's a good question, Grace. I think that if we were all being perfect genealogists, we would examine that, uber original copy of the record. But I would say it is fine to consider that digitized copy to be your original record, with the caveat that normally if there is information found on the back, or if there's a record to the front of it or the back of it that also is relevant, you should be searching to the front and the back when you're browsing through the digitized images. It's general practice when they're digitizing records that if there's something written on the back of a record, that also gets filmed. Granted, I'm sure that's not always true, and that is an example where if you had the actual record in your hands, that would be very helpful. The other problem you can have is that a lot of the times the reason why a record is available digitized is because they don't want people handling it anymore. So you may want to go and seek out that original record, and you might be told when you get to the archive that they're not going to pull it out for you because it's already digitized online. So just a couple of things to keep in mind.
Thank you. Now, Jerry Lynn says that access to birth records is sometimes restricted due to privacy or security issues related to identity theft and other issues. Of course, I know that we've probably all experienced that at one point, trying to get to a vital record and saying no, you can't. It's still private. If those birth records in particular are inaccessible, what are some other types of records that are considered reliable for birth dates?
So this comes up especially when we're trying to create lineage applications and things like that, where we have to amass births, marriages, and deaths on a person. And you're right, sometimes you won't have access to that original birth record. One of the things that we'll be talking about in the next section is church records, and a baptism is generally accepted as a substitute. And as we'll talk about later, a baptismal record might also include the birth date on it. There are other records that are created where you have to list your birth date. One of the ones that we use often when we're talking about the 20th century is like a World War I draft card. Other kinds of military records, usually they asked for a specific birth date, and that is generally considered as reasonable evidence to prove somebody's birth date.
Thanks. And regarding delayed registrations, so you showed an example from Nova Scotia in which kind of, to sum up, it sounded like the province kind of stopped or requiring civil registrations for a period of time. Then they started up again and wanted that information retroactively. Are there other situations that would cause a delayed registration, if there's kind of a known loss of records, or are there other things that might come up? And how would you go about researching why it's a delayed registration or a delayed record?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I encounter a lot when I'm working on cases, especially out west or in the Midwest, is that people were moving so frequently that they don't get picked up. And a lot of these states that heavily relied on delayed registration are out in the Midwest and the West because they just didn't have the record keeping in place at the time. So what kind of things can we explain that? Could you restate the question a little bit, Ginevra? The second part?
Sure. I mean, so thinking about the questions that you went through in the beginning as far as analyzing the record. So if you're confronted with a delayed registration, it seems like a good course of action is to determine why it's a delayed registration. What was the cause of that? Could that perhaps inform future research, or at least inform your understanding of that delayed record? So do you go to the wiki page on Family Search? Are there other ways to kind of learn why a delayed registration happened, and if it's on a case-by-case basis, or if this is something that's happening kind of on a larger scale?
I would say that in most circumstances, it's a case-by-case thing, and a lot of times it's when you're looking at something like a Family Search wiki, or if you pull up the catalog on Family Search, sometimes it'll note it right in the top section, major record loss that occurred, and it's just nailing down exactly what was happening in that place at the time. And like I said, even when laws were in place, you might find that the place where your ancestors lived, they weren't keeping records. They weren't keeping detailed records just because they weren't complying with the law yet. So it is extremely locality specific.
Now, Grace says that that she's heard stories of people requesting letters from former neighbors or family members when Social Security registration came in and people were entitled to benefits based on birth date. Is there any way to access those records, and what kind of came from those requests?
In that particular example, you can order a copy of somebody's application for Social Security, which will include those kind of documents that they use as evidence of their birth. In particular, that's a great way of finding information about someone that maybe wasn't born in this country, because you often, for not just your citizenship, but to apply for Social Security, needed to have some kind of verified record of your birth. And in cases where somebody didn't have a delayed registration, yes, you would use testimony to support that.
And just to clarify, where do you request that information or that application?
You can do it through the U.S. government, the National Archives. There are links online to that. Also, if you happen to be looking at the Social Security applications database on Ancestry, when you go down into the source details, there are helpful links that will direct you to a website where you can order the record. Also, you can order it and it'll be expedited if you pay money, but you also have a right to request information through the Freedom of Information Act if you wanted to go that way too.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for your questions. Definitely keep them coming. For right now, I'm going to turn things back over to James, and we're going to talk now about church records, which, of course, he just mentioned is a great vital record substitute. So back over to you, James.
All right. In our final section, we're going to take a closer look at church records, and we'll discuss the kinds of church records we can expect to find, how to determine our ancestors' religion, and the value of church records in our research. But to offer a friendly warning right up front, just as vital records are extremely locality specific, so too are church records, and they're directly linked to the belief systems that created them. When determining where to look for church records, consider the hierarchical structure of each religion. For example, the Roman Catholic Church is organized into parishes, which together form a diocese. Records may be located at the parish church, or they may have been centralized into that diocese. Lutheran denominations may retain their records themselves or send them to a regional synod. In some cases, the records of one church may be held by its successor church. Denominations consolidate and are always collapsing over time, but you'll never locate a record where one was never created. Familiarize yourself with the main beliefs of the religion. Did they baptize? At what age? Was marriage considered a civil or a church event? The types of records that you might encounter are as varied as the religious groups themselves. Don't always think in terms of just baptisms, marriages, and deaths. A wealth of information can be found in non-traditional sources like membership lists, admittance records, and financial records. Here's an example of a Quaker meeting record. These records tend to include extremely detailed accounts from each Quaker meeting. A nice quirk to research in these records is that it's fairly easy to track the movement of families. A Quaker family had to ask for permission to leave their current meeting for another, and a letter of referral was often produced. The new meeting would then take a vote on whether to accept or deny that referral, which means you get records of their movements in both where they left and where they went to. In this record, we have Deborah Fell atoning for having been present at a non-Quaker wedding in 1818. The record tells us that Deborah belonged to the Chester monthly meeting and that she was present there in February 1818. If you were trying to locate Deborah's death record, you'd know to look after February 23, 1818, the date of the record. This record does lack specificity, though. How do we know that we're looking at the correct Deborah Fell? Maybe there were two Deborah Fells that were at the Chester monthly meeting in 1818. And here's an example of a burial record from Maple Grove Anglican Church in the community of Ireland, Quebec. Quebec church records are often rich in detail, presented in a paragraph form. In Quebec, the burden of collecting vital records was placed on each religious community. Each religious leader was tasked with reporting the vital records from their community. As a result, baptism records almost always include the date of birth, and marriage records will almost always include the names of the witnesses to the ceremony. In this burial record for Charles Bennett, shoemaker, we also find the names of two witnesses to his burial, Levi Bennett and William Bennett, who signed with a mark. So in what kinds of ways can we determine an ancestor's religion? Religion had a huge influence on our ancestors, often defining the communities they lived in, where they settled, and who they married. Family tradition might tell you that your family was of a certain religion, or you may need to do a bit of research on your own. Using cluster research, you can examine the families that interacted with your own to see if your ancestors were entrenched in a particular religious community. Are you lucky enough to have inherited a family Bible? The version can be an indication of the original owner's religion. Douay Bibles are most common in Catholicism, or a copy of the King James Bible is likely from a Protestant ancestor. Each Bible was a translation specially prepared and approved by that specific religious community. Local histories will often include sections about the predominant religious organizations in an area. Here's an example from the history of Marshfield, Mass., which includes a background on the religions most common in the area. You can also try searching for newspaper notices announcing a marriage or death. These will often include someone's place of worship as it relates to the event. An obituary like this one may record the place where the funeral services were conducted. Ernestine Campbell was a member of St. Joseph's Church. An ancestor's name may also appear in articles about church events. Alternatively, if your ancestors immigrated from a region with a particular religious identity, you may be able to infer what their religion was from that. An ancestor with a French-sounding surname, born in Quebec, is probably going to be Catholic. Your Scotch-Irish ancestors were probably Calvinists, and you should probably check for the nearest Presbyterian church. This doesn't always work out when you consider that many people leave their native countries to escape religious persecution. In cases where economic opportunity motivated immigration, you may be able to rely on the religious character of an area to form assumptions. Locating the cemetery where your ancestor is buried can also lead you to their church. Many cemeteries have religious affiliations. Even if your ancestors are buried in a secular cemetery, their close relatives may not, so check around. And finally, vital records are an excellent source of information about your ancestors' religion. As we've seen, a death record may include the name of the cemetery where they're buried, and that cemetery may have a religious affiliation. Later in the presentation, we'll explore how a civil marriage record can lead us to its church record match. Even if we can locate the place where our ancestor worshipped, it isn't always very easy to track down the records. A big problem is the lack of permanence of some religious groups. Religious movements come and go, church buildings are repurposed, and the records are lost in the shuffle. Here are a few recommendations for determining what records still exist for a church or religious community. Start by contacting local historical societies. They might have some church records in their collections, but more likely, they can put you in touch with someone who has a familiarity with or has done research on the church you're looking for. You probably won't be the first to wonder and to ask where the records are. Of course, take a look online. Genealogy websites like Ancestry, Family Search, and American Ancestors hold large collections of church records. Search their catalogs for your area of interest. And it sounds overly simple, but run a Google search with key terms like the name of the religious group and place and the word records. It might lead you to a cataloged entry from a historical or university archive, a helpful blog post, or a published source. Additional information about the history and records of a church can be found on some modern church websites. The About section of a church website sometimes includes important dates in their history, including when they subsumed or broke away from other churches. You can try contacting the modern church. You might find that the original church books are sitting on a shelf in the basement. In these cases, you might encounter varying degrees of helpfulness from the church staff, especially when guidelines don't really exist for access to the collection. And one final warning. Your ancestors may not have worshipped in the same place where they lived. Check a few towns over. Try to cast a wide net. What's the value of a church record, especially when we compare it to a vital record? You may be able to track where a family was living based on where their children were baptized or married. In that way, a church record can serve as a census substitute because it places that individual in a specific place at a specific time. From that, you can make inferences about where you'll find extended relatives. Given the importance of religious events, witnesses and sponsors were usually drawn from close family. In some religions, the baptismal sponsors were seen as surrogates for the parents, agreeing to take care of the child if the parents were unable to. In immigrant populations, they may be relatives or friends from the home country. A church record might also contain additional information not related to the specific event. A baptismal record often contains the date of birth. Sometimes a later notation links a baptism to a marriage record from that church or another. Church records are also a potential goldmine of information on families that weren't recorded in vital records. That could have happened for a number of reasons. There might have been an error in reporting the vital record. The vital record may have been destroyed. A recently arrived immigrant family might not have been aware of the laws surrounding the proper reporting of a child's birth. Through a partnership with the Catholic Archdiocese of Boston, American Ancestors has been working on digitizing and indexing Catholic church records from eastern Massachusetts. In one parish, volunteers found that only about half the births recorded by the church in 1862 were found in the state vital record returns. And in that instance, a lot of records slipped through the cracks. Because marriages are both a civil and a religious event, locating one can lead you to the other. Civil marriage records will often include the name of the officiant, making it possible to determine the religion and specific church where the ceremony was performed. In this example, we have James O'Neill and Rosanna Cairns, who were married in Boston on December 25, 1872. The state copy of their marriage record notes that it was performed by Reverend R. W. Brady of Boston. Sometimes a marriage record will also include the address where the ceremony was performed. If you're given the address, it may be possible to consult a historic directory and determine the church attached to it. In this case, I went after a little bit more information about Reverend Brady. The method is a little bit of guess and check and some online sleuthing. By Googling the officiant and location, you may turn up a directory of ministers or priests like this one. You may also find the officiant named in newspaper articles related to the goings-on at the church. From this 1872 directory, we know that Reverend Brady was connected to Jesuit St. Mary's Church in Boston, as we see at the top of the page there. The Archives of the Archdiocese of Boston retains the original church registers from St. Mary's, which have now been digitized on AmericanAncestors.org. I was able to use the date from the marriage record to find the correct entry in the church volumes, which brings us to this church record, including the names of John Griffin and Margaret Keefe. Previous research identified Margaret Keefe as the bride's sister, and both their names are not present on the civil record. Where vital records are missing or were never recorded, a church record may be the only way to track the birth, marriage, and death of your ancestor. The following is a case study of how church records can act as substitutes for vital records. In this 1880 census record, we rejoin James O'Neill and Rosanna Cairns 8 years after their marriage at St. Mary's in Boston. They're still living in Boston. The left-hand side has a column on the census form that tells us that they were then living at Erin Court in Boston. Their household includes 5 children. The oldest, Michael A., is 16, born about 1864 in Vermont. He's James's son from a previous marriage. We had no idea who his mother was or where he was in census records from before or after this one. He was kind of an enigma. The first verifiable record we had located for Dad James was the 1872 marriage we looked at before. Most records say that he was born in New York City. Notice also James and Rosanna's youngest son, also named James, who according to the census record was 2 months old, born in April 1880. He too was kind of an enigma. He died in 1883, that we knew. We had a copy of his death record, but not his birth. We tried all sorts of creative searching techniques for his 1880 birth record, including going page by page in the registers, but found nothing in the city or state records. Knowing where the family was living within 2 months of baby James's birth, and that the family was Catholic, we wondered if locating the nearest Catholic church to the O'Neill family could lead us to his baptismal record and by extension his birth date. We determined that the nearest Catholic church, one likely to include an Irish Catholic family among its parishioners, was just 3 blocks away. This map shows the location of the O'Neill household in 1880 in blue, and the location of Most Holy Redeemer Catholic Church in green. And in the registers from 1880, we found the baptism of Jacobus, Latin for James, O'Neill on May 9, 1880. And it immediately answered one of our questions from that 1880 census. According to the priest, R.L. Walsh, and Most Holy Redeemer Church, James O'Neill was born on April 23, 1880. In lieu of a birth record, we used this record as a substitute. One thing that this record has that the birth record never would, though, are the names of the baptismal sponsors, Arthur M. O'Neill and Eliza McDermott. We were particularly interested in Arthur O'Neill, a new unknown name from the O'Neill family. Maybe James O'Neill, the father's brother? In looking for Arthur O'Neill in Boston records, we came across this marriage record from 1886. Arthur O'Neill, born about 1865 in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, son of James and Mary O'Neill, who married Elizabeth Sheehan of Boston. Tracking this couple, we found birth records for their children that included Arthur's middle initial of M. Given the similarities between this Arthur M. O'Neill and the Michael A. O'Neill found in the 1880 census, we concluded that they were one and the same. We tracked Arthur O'Neill back to Vermont and his birth captured in the vital records there. Arthur O'Neill, born January 20th, 1866 in St. Johnsbury, son of James O'Neill of New York and Mary Bragg of Canada. And since we know never to be satisfied with this kind of transcribed record, we decided to look at the original register from St. Johnsbury so that we could assess its substance and its reliability. In this case, we were able to use church records to confirm and supplement information from census and vital records. We demonstrated the value of church records to document an event missing from vital records and to use the names of witnesses to open up new avenues for research. Without locating James O'Neill's 1880 baptismal record, it's unclear if we would have been able to trace his father and half-brother back to Vermont before James's 1872 marriage in Boston. In review, keep these points in mind as you use vital and church records to search for your ancestors. Remember to analyze the substance and reliability of every record you find and maintain a healthy skepticism. Find and analyze every version of a record and keep an eye out for any information pointing you towards your next record set. And that brings us to our homework assignment for next week. The homework asks you to take a look at this Phoenix, Arizona birth record for Eleanor Nellie Dunn, a copy of which you'll find with your handouts. And as you're going through this record, I want you to fill out your record analysis worksheet with your impressions from the record, and ultimately its reliability, and what kinds of things you can pull from that record that might lead you to avenues for further research.
All right. Well, thank you again, James, for that fantastic presentation. Let's pause here for any final questions from tonight's class. Go ahead and type it into the chat panel. And I also want to just make it clear that it is a homework and a suggested at-homework assignment. We're not collecting your answers. We're not grading you at this point. So just if you want to kind of start to apply what James has gone through in tonight's class, this is just kind of an at-home exercise that you can try. We will go over the answers at the start of the next class. So take that and do what you will with it. So we do have a few questions. So Anne asks, can you offer any guidance to the etiquette or maybe best practices for approaching church employees who sometimes are not willing or very eager to follow through with a record request? She says, I generally call and then follow up with emails, being polite, but this doesn't always work. Do you have any suggestions for reaching out to churches and trying to access their records, which may be in their basement or kept in the parish hall or that sort of thing?
Thanks, Anne. It is one of the trickiest things about church records, especially when you go and you try to contact them yourself. Because, like I said, they might not have any kind of structures in place to dictate how to respond to a request. And, you know, they're not genealogists. Their reason for keeping the records has nothing to do with you being able to search them later. And it really is just, it depends on who you're talking to. I think we've all kind of heard those stories of going to a church and finding out that the priest wants nothing to do with the genealogist sitting down with the books. I think you're following the correct procedures, calling, emailing, but like you said, those can only get you so far. One thing I will mention, which I've heard has had varying degrees of success, is offering donations, something small, that gets into a quagmire of, how much do you offer and things like that. But to some extent, I've heard that can grease the wheels. It's really just if one administrator at the church has decided that they do not want anybody accessing those records, least of all you, who may not be somebody from that church, you may never get to see them. Which does raise the other point that if you knew somebody who was a communicant there or attended their worship there, then maybe they could give you an in. But how many people are we going to know that attend churches where our ancestors did? So yeah, I think you're following the right steps. It's unfortunate when you reach one that you just can't crack.
Thanks. And Michael asks, so if a person was baptized in, say, a congregational church in Massachusetts around 1720, is there kind of a rule of thumb of, concerning how soon that happened after the date of birth? What have you found in your research? And is there kind of a more or less guaranteed rule of thumb?
The short answer is no. You see a lot of entries where it's someone who's days old. Very often you'll see that a family had a bunch of kids in one place, and then they move to a new place, they become members of the congregational church, and they decide to baptize a few of their kids that didn't get baptized in the last town. And they might be a range of ages. That could be, one could be 2, the other could be 6. It really depends on the family. If we're talking specifically about Massachusetts, I would recommend that you look at the congregational archives in Boston. They should be able to help you with some more specific information about the church where your ancestors worshipped.
And in the case that you just mentioned, if a family moves or they join a new church and they're baptizing maybe a few of their kids around the same time, is that kind of another situation in when recognizing the handwriting of maybe the priest or the clerk, if they're putting 3 kids around the same time, in the same ink and the same penmanship, is that kind of a good indication that that's occurring, or should you not read too closely into that?
Yeah, it's always good to dissect for those kind of things, especially when we're talking about baptisms. Usually you'll find everybody who was baptized on a certain day under the same column heading. That's a generalization, but it's something that I've noticed, that if there are multiple kids from the same family, they're usually listed sequentially. So that's generally how they'll pop up.
And when that statistic that you mentioned, that in looking, I think it was in one parish or maybe one church, that only 40% of those marriages or baptisms, church baptisms, were actually recorded in the civil registrations. That's a huge distinction. Do you... First of all, as far as compliance goes, we talked about when kind of maybe the state registration took place and then general compliance is later. Was there any reason or impetus for people to start doing civil registrations and for that general compliance to take place? Were they paid a certain amount? What was in it really for our ancestors to go through with civil registration at a certain point?
Well, when we start talking about the 20th century, we'll talk about those kind of programs where knowing your birth date was necessary. In terms of general compliance and reporting, there were things put in place to kind of incentivize people to report. The people who tend to slip through the cracks are probably people that had their children at home, and there was no record that maybe they just had child number 8 when they've already had 7. But there are also things like when somebody dies, there's a physician's certificate, or there's the medical examiner's portion of it, which accompanies the body to the funeral home, and the funeral home fills out a part of that certificate too. And it's only after that certificate is filled out that it eventually makes it to the Board of Health or whoever collects the vital record. But yeah, I think that part of the reason why there were so many people who were baptized in that parish and then they don't show up in civil records is because there wasn't as much of an impetus to make sure that you did. And it's something that over the course of the 19th century, but up into the 20th century, they had to build in structures that would mandate these things to happen. And if you didn't have a birth record, you had to go and get some kind of delayed copy of it.
And also, so is there kind of a best practice if you're in that point where general compliance is taking place that, if you have the vital record, you always look for the church record. If you have the church record, you always look for the vital record. I mean, is it best practice really to get both at all costs?
Yeah, because each has a different thing to say. Each had its own motivation for being created. And so in a lot of cases, they'll parrot each other, but you're going to find different information on each normally.
All right. Now, Luis asks, was there any rule of thumb to how soon after death a burial would take place?
A lot of that is defined by the religion of the person. There are different dictates depending on your religion for when you should be in the ground. Obviously, there are things that can slow that. But generally, if we're talking about before modern embalming and things like that, there is a shelf life to how long a body can stay above ground before the burial.
So no strict rule of thumb, it really depends. Now, Jenny asks, so if someone didn't have a birth certificate or copy of one and wanted to get a passport, what would they have had to do? And she's wondering if you can still find a birth record for them.
A lot of those earlier passports, they don't have birth records attached to them. I've seen some of them up into the 1920s where it's usually based on somebody providing an affidavit. Like you see it a lot with business people because they would have the means to go and travel back and forth, where somebody who's like the director of a bank or something could be like, I vouch that this person has been in this country for this long and is entitled to a passport, and like those sorts of things. I think that a lot of passport requirements, like having your birth certificate attached, is more of a modern thing.
All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for your great questions. If anything comes up as you review the presentation, as you start to go through the homework assignment or you review the handouts, feel free to email me directly, and my email is gmorse@nehgs.org. You should have received an email from me, and I will also respond or send you an email once the recording is available. So you can always reach me that way. You can also reach James directly. His email address is available on the handout for this class. And of course, if you'd like more hands-on help with your research, you can consider scheduling a consultation or hiring our research services teams. That contact information is available on the screen in front of you. So as I mentioned, starting tomorrow, or actually later this evening, you'll find a recording of this class on the course page, as well as the handouts and slides and that homework assignment. So you can go straight to americanancestors.org/education/online-classes/advanced-look-course. Again, a very long and complicated URL, which I will include in my follow-up email to you. But do return to that page often over the next couple of weeks, as we will continue to add materials and recordings. So thank you again for joining us for the first class of this 5-session seminar. Be sure to join us next Wednesday at the same time when we'll take an advanced look at getting the most from state and federal censuses. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center, americanancestors.org/education. I look forward to seeing you online next week. Goodbye for now.